Welcome to the Dreams of Conscious podcast. If you'd be so kind, would you mind introducing yourself?
I'm Kakophonix, and I'm the cellist and composer of Hvile I Kaos.
And Kakophonix, how would you describe the music of Hvile I Kaos? What kind of music would you say you make?
Black ritual chamber music. It's essentially black metal in a chamber music context with the cello as the primary foundational instrument.
So this is something that comes up from time to time, and I usually ask bands who call themselves or are called black metal what black metal means to them. So let's start with that. What does black metal mean to you?
It's more of a spiritual discipline than a genre of music for me. It has much more to do with the devotion to chaos and the void and the phenomena that dwell within.
Now, as a cellist, do you feel that black metal is tied to any specific instruments or any specific sound?
Well, I mean, there are the typecasts that come with the genre of tremolo picking and blast beats and shrieking, but also the cello has for me lent itself very well to not only making my own original work, but also I've done a lot of session work as well for black metal bands, and it has always been a very natural and unabashed thing for me.
You feel that the cello lends itself well to black metal, either
I've always felt
as a
that way. Yeah,
primary instrument or accompanying, as you said, tremolo picking and blast beats.
yeah. I've always felt that they go well together.
So a lot of my feelings about this, and one of the reasons why I was eager to talk to you about your music, um, go back to when I heard the Second Emperor album, and they did um, a classical version of uh, Ino Satana, um, which they read it as a classical piece, and it dawned on me that classical music, well, certain types of classical music or certain classical composers and black metal overlapped with each other. The only difference was the instruments that they used. And since then, I've always felt that you know one would be the other if you just change the instruments. Um, and I say this knowing that you yourself have done a cover of a dissection song. So I think we probably share some sentiments.
That would be a reasonable assumption. Yeah, I always felt like when I formed Billy Calls when I was 19 out of my bedroom, I basically felt like I wanted to create black metal in a different instrumental context with just at the time it was a simple cello quartet. It was like literally like early apocalyptica, but with a more black metal slant to it. And I always felt like I was capturing the essence of the genre in a different format. Like I even just called it cellistic black metal, which in hindsight is really kind of corny, but that's what I called it at the time. And it's always been a very natural thing for me to use the cello and use different instrumental arrangements in a black metal context. That has always made a whole lot of sense to me.
Well, let's speak about your background for a bit. Uh, are you classically trained? When you was it the cello first before black metal?
Yes, I've been playing cello since I was 9. And I come from a family of classical musicians, so they insisted I take lessons and do things properly in that department. And I wasn't really, I was kind of resistant to it as a kid until I discovered Apocalyptica when I was 14 and was like, wow, the cello and metal go well together. And that seemed like a perfectly natural and normal thing for me at the time. And then I started taking my music seriously. I went to a performing arts high school. I worked my little butt off and eventually went through a conservatory and a master's program. And here we are.
Cool. So, in addition to, you mentioned Apocalyptica. I remember the band Amber Asylum, who kind of crossed over into metal a little bit. They released a few albums on Relapse, I believe. Um,
Yeah, People keep telling me to check them out. I've never really given them a proper listen, but I know that they do use string arrangements to great effect.
Yeah. Um, but I mean, there are also artists like Warren Ellis who worked with Nick Cave, who does a lot of uh, soundtrack work and film scores. I mean, outside of metal, do you find a lot of inspiration from either current composers or current uh, artists, I guess, who work with the cello or who work with a lot of arrangements?
Well, there are definitely loop cellists like Zoe Keating, Matthew Shaning, Helen Money, those people who sit down and do looping and multi-tracking with the cello and create sort of their own soundscapes. I've never really gotten good at looping. It's something that I should probably lean into, but I like cellists like that. I also like folk music to a certain. I'm not going to claim to be an aficionado of it, but I went to a fiddle camp where Alistair Fraser and Natalie Haas were doing their thing, and was really pleasantly surprised by how all out these musicians have to go. There's really no room for stage fright or anything. You just play a melody back two or three times, and then you're expected to know it and riff off of it. It's a world away from classical music, but string instruments are a foundational base for that type of folk music. I thought that was really cool. Um,
Sure. I mean,
I've never
I'm
really
assuming that.
got, sorry.
Go ahead, go ahead.
No, I didn't really have anything of substance to say.
Uh, I'm assuming that the career path for a cellist is not to start a black metal band. Did you have something else in mind? Were you planning on being a composer or getting into film scores or anything like that?
Not really, to be honest. I've always been just enamored with extreme metal and underground music and wanted to make my career with that. And I think I've, to an extent, done that. There's certainly territory left unconquered that lies before me, but I definitely feel like I've made my mark in underground music, for lack of a better description.
Now, when you formed Hvile I Kaos, what were your plans? What were your objectives? What did you want to accomplish with this?
So initially, this is where you might get into ideological territory a little bit. Initially, the band that really inspired me to form Hvile I Kaos was Dissection, and I didn't really understand the ideological nitty gritty of what John and Dissection were after at the time. I understood that chaos was a big part of it. I understood that there was a left hand path aspect to it. I found his story intriguing, and there was something I could tell that there was something lurking below the surface of that music that I couldn't quite put my finger on. But Dissection was a band that really was a catalyst for me wanting to do what I do with music. And initially, the band was sort of a springboard for me to explore music composition and explore my own artistic freedom, as it were. But as things progressed, I eventually knew there was something deeper I needed to explore on an existential or spiritual level if I wanted to make the music that I really wanted to make. I knew that there was an ingredient to it that wasn't purely artistic or musical. And it took a while for me to really put my finger on the fact that that was a spiritual component.
Right. And what is the spiritual component that uh, influences you? That's found in Hvile I Kaos' music.
Hmm. Chaos. I would definitely say that the formless expanse beyond time and space and the entities that dwell within have always really been the motivating force behind Hvile I Kaos, even before I understood that that's what they were.
Now, on the records, are you playing all the instruments?
Yes.
Yeah. And when you approach a composition, how does it how do you usually do that? How do you usually start?
I start with a key motive or riff, and then once that motive or riff or melody takes shape, I understand what character or intention has manifested itself to me. And so from that point forward, I understand that there's a specific intent I need to communicate. And so I make all my choices with the textures because there are no lyrics. So I'm communicating the message purely with instrumental music. I would say the intent and the composition are sort of a dialogue, as it were. Like I'll come up with a melody, and then that melody will represent something, and then I'll understand what I need to communicate with that melody, and then I'll build the piece around that intent.
So this is something I ask people who come from a classical or music school background, but is your approach to song structure different from maybe, you know, uh the typical rock or metal band, which would be like, intro verse, chorus verse, etc.
Yeah, I'd say that I'm actually when I first started composing, my initial liabilities were that I would just sort of do riff, 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 just sort of chunky, uh, disconnected ideas. It took a while for me to really figure out how to seamlessly write transitions and phrases. Um, I do have kind of a verse chorus understanding, but then it definitely meanders and deviates from there.
Right.
Um, I don't. I'm not really beholden to any conventional song structures now.
Yeah. You mentioned it starts with a melody a lot of the time. Um,
Melody or a riff, yeah.
yeah. But does that mean that you're starting on the cello, or are you starting on something else like a keyboard?
Usually I start on the cello, but sometimes I'll come up with a chord progression on the guitar. Um, I'm not a very good guitarist. The guitar is more of a songwriting tool for me. Um, but occasionally I'll come up with a basic chord progression on the guitar and then build something interesting and good or around that on the cello.
Now, does it translate easily from a guitar to a cello when you come up with a riff?
Or at least think, yeah, they're the range of the instrument is very similar.
Okay. So as we're having this conversation, you'll be releasing a new album at the end of the week called Lower Order Manifestations.
Yes,
And I believe this will be the final release you put out as Hvile I Kaos. Is that correct?
that is correct. It's been made clear to me that this is the final offering. And lower order manifestations was always meant to be an offering of something very close and vulnerable to me. I didn't quite understand going into it just how much was going to be asked of me. But as we're approaching the release, it's been made clear that, for lack of a better phrasing of it, that the sacrifice of the band itself was always going to be placed upon that altar in regards to what the record was always dealing with.
Now, when you say it was made clear to you, how and by who?
I wouldn't say who is the right word, more like by what. Um, I'm not gonna get too um, let's see, so just give me a second. I'm
Sure.
not going to name this force or this phenomenon or say specifically what I offered to it, but that offering was very heavy and the price was very heavy. And what was asked and what was required of me were very, very heavy. And I believe that the force that I offered the album to wanted more. And the band itself seems to have been what was ultimately going to be asked. Yes.
When did you start working on this album?
Forgive me.
When did you start working on this album?
Oh, during the pandemic, 2020. Uh, I think the initial ideas were right before the pandemic, so it's been a ultimately like a 4 or 5 year process.
And a couple of these songs were released on a split with Grave Gnosis.
That's correct.
Yeah. Uh,
Um,
did you already have a framework in mind for how you wanted the full album to sound when you released those two songs?
yeah, most of the initial ideas were done. That split was actually a teaser of both the Hvile I Kaos and Grave Gnosis albums, because both of the Grave Gnosis songs were eventually on their full length as well. Um, I recorded demos for all of the songs and then eventually re-recorded everything for the final takes. It was but of course, doing everything myself, it was a very long and arduous process.
And when you say doing everything yourself, in addition to playing all the instruments, did you also handle the recording aspect, the
Yes,
engineering aspect? Yeah. Do you have your own
not
home
entirely.
studio?
I do have my own home studio. That's where I'm sitting right now. It's literally a closet. It's nothing fancy. Uh, but the engineering aspect was handled by my friend Adam Oliver. I recorded everything at home, but Adam Oliver, who's a colleague of mine, mixed and mastered the album.
Do you want to talk about the themes of the album and what you may have taken inspiration from to give the album structure?
Um, the
You don't have
inspiration
to.
from
I'm
the album
just
was taken from yes, the inspiration from the album was taken from a grimoire called Codex Versum. The the title "Lower Order Manifestations" is referring to late eight lower order spirits, ultimately leading to the throne and altar of the greater force to which the album is dedicated.
and
And the whole the intent of the workings and each piece systematically is an offering of the piece of oneself to that force.
and the book that you refer to, Codex Versum, was written by Cain del Sol from Grave Gnosis. Is that right?
That's correct. That's correct.
Yeah. Um, are you and Cain close?
Not especially. We've worked. We were at one point. We kind of drifted apart, but our workings have led us in different directions. Ultimately, though, um, Grave Gnosis and Hvile I Kaos have always been independent entities with independent goals.
Right. I'm just curious why Codex Versum, um, why you drew such an inspiration from that book.
Well, I had worked with Grave Gnosis before, and I worked on two of their albums, and some things happened while I was working on those albums that left an undeniable mark on my psyche, and I wanted to explore further.
Sure. Uh, so you handled all the instrumentation on the album, but you also had some guest contributors. Do you want to say who those were?
A lot of people. I'd actually have to pull up the list if you don't mind. Just give me a second.
Sure, no
Um,
worries.
so the yeah, I can't. You'll forgive me. I can't remember everyone off
That's
the
fine.
top.
I'm just so most of the contributions were vocals. Is that right?
That is correct, with the
Yeah.
exception of one death whistle on Panic Sun. There
Yeah.
was a a death whistle contribution by Nero Outram, and All the rest of the contributions were vocal. Um, those included my girlfriend Elizabeth Gore, Kane and Scarlett from Grave Gnosis, Joseph Spiller. I could just go down the list. Layla Lagarde from, I forget her project's name. One of her projects is Hawthorne. It's more of an occult neo-folk project from the UK. My friend Sarah, Dan. I don't. I mean, a lot of these. Do you want me to go down the whole list? Because there's a lot of people.
I don't know if it's necessary. I mean,
Fair.
if
Go ahead.
you
No, it's fair.
feel the need to,
It's
then
it's
you
fair.
can.
It's listed on the Bandcamp,
Yeah.
but
But I think in terms of why you chose them, and you mentioned that most of these people are your friends. Is it important for you to collaborate with your friends, with the people in your personal life, or to include them in the music somehow?
it depends. Um, ultimately, it's fairly important. Um, Not everyone who contributed to the album were people I knew super well. Sometimes I would just put up sort of a public service announcement like, "Hey, I need screams, like scream like you're being tortured." And I got a few people to submit that for me. Um, some of these people I'm closer to than others, but I'm grateful for all the contributions regardless.
So the music of Hvile I Kaos is largely instrumental. I'm curious when you decide to include vocals, sometimes they're spoken word, sometimes they're chanting. Um, what leads to that decision? How do you feel, or how do you make the choice that some songs require vocals and some songs don't?
It really depends. With the vast majority of the vocal contributions on the record are on Panic Sun, and that's more just screams. There's not singing. It's not even really metal screams. It's just tortured cacophony, as it were. I just wanted it to sound like a hellscape, as it were, and I wanted as many people to contribute as possible. With another piece on the album called "My Hatred Is Just," is chanting the name of the spirit, and the I wanted it to have more of a warlike, militant quality to it. So the and the people on My Hatred Is Just for people I was much more closely involved with. But with Panic Sun, it was really just like, give me all your screams. That was, and there was a very specific picture I was hoping to paint with Panic Sun in particular.
Right. Is the album meant to be listened to in a specific order, in the order that you released it?
Yes.
Yeah. And is this due to the ritual aspect of Hibili Kasa's music?
Yes, and specifically the ritual aspect of what's outlined in Codex Aversa.
Sure. You mentioned that you handled the recording yourself. Who handled the mixing and mastering?
My friend Adam Oliver, he's a colleague of mine, um, very very competent producer, and made it sound absolutely massive.
So we spoke a little bit, or I guess you mentioned that a mutual friend of ours put us in touch or gave you my contact. And that's Aurora from the band Nixel. I saw Nixel live for the first time, uh, uh, I guess a month ago, a little over a month ago. And the thing that struck me, what you get from seeing them live, which you don't get from listening to their music, is the ritual aspect in their performance. Like it's clear that they're very much meant for their music to be experienced live in a certain way. Is is it the same for you in Helix House?
Yes, obviously, live performances are no more, but when we did play live, they were they were decidedly rituals. We would perform in a horseshoe formation around an evocation triangle with incense and a very specific arrangement of candles. And yeah, the stage became an altar as we performed our invocations. Yes.
And with with your live performances, do you perform solo or do you have a collective of musicians that you collaborate with?
I had a 5 piece live band. Yes, that has been disbanded since the beginning of this year. But I had a very good live band. Actually, I'm very grateful for everyone who performed. Um, but as it were, the as I wind the band and the praxis down, there's no more reason to be performing live. But we had some very special and very profound experiences on the live front.
Right. Uh, I'm curious with the ritual aspects in your music and uh in your live performances, what do you want your audience to come away with? What do you want them to experience?
Okay, so there's what I want them to experience, and then there's what they have experienced, which don't necessarily conflict. I definitely want them to experience a window into our spiritual world, and that has been delivered. I have had audience members come up to me and say that they heard dead relatives speaking to them while we played, or saw apparitions, or saw the stage move, or saw some sort of portal open, all of which are valid and desirable.
Right. Uh, would you say there's a supernatural aspect to your music?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. What was the purpose of Hvile I Kaos to tap into the supernatural?
After a certain point, yes, absolutely it was.
Yeah. So this is something that we touched on, but you did mention that this will be the last Hvile I Kaos release. Um, are you, as a musician, looking to branch out into new projects?
Well, my main or primarily focus now, as far as my active project goes, is in the Jupiter, which has a very different but equally profound spiritual component to it. It's much more universe positive, life positive, much more life affirming, as it were. Whereas the energy behind Billy Cos was much more inward and backward, as it were, much more towards the darkness and chaos side of things. Um, I'll eventually form something new once I figure out what I want my personal trajectory to be beyond Billy Cos. But as it stands, the I believe that the work I set out to achieve with Billy Cos has been accomplished in its own way, just not in ways that I previously foresaw.
We began our conversation speaking about the overlap between classical music and black metal, and um, you know, musically what the two share. Do you feel like there's more to say? Do you have more to say in terms of making black metal with classical instrumentation
Like I feel
in
like
a
with this
musical
final
sense? Yeah.
record, I have pushed that format in the at least within the framework of my own abilities. I feel like I've pushed that format to its limit.
So at the current time, you don't see yourself continuing projects in this vein.
Not this specific thing. No, I'll happily work with other black metal bands as a session musician, but I feel like what I did with Vidikas was something very specific, and I can't see myself topping what I achieved with lower order manifestations now.
When you look back on this, what are you most proud of about Hvile Kaos?
What am I most proud of? Well, I mean, the music itself, obviously, I don't regret any of it. Um, and I believe that Vidikas set out to do um, exactly what it's done, which is to be a vehicle for chaos to enter the world, to be a channel for those forces to make themselves known. And I feel like anyone who's been close to the band in any capacity would agree with me that we've accomplished that.
So by the time people hear this, lower order manifestations will be out. Cacophonix, can you tell everyone listening to this and watching it on YouTube how they can order the album? What's the best way to get it?
Well, you can order it from the Hvile I Kaos Bandcamp page, either in digital or physical formats. And the physical formats are linked to our record label, Invite Manifestatio, who's handling the physical pressings. There's also going to be a shirt available. And you can also stream it on all platforms, courtesy of our friends from Eisenwald and House of Incantation.
Now, tell me about the physical releases. And are the three labels all handling different aspects of the physical releases?
No, Invite Manifestatio is the only one handling any aspect of the physical release. The artwork was done by an artist from Indonesia who goes by Frostbite, which is it's a very arcane, profound, and relevant image. And then the booklet artwork was handled by Michael Schultz, who is one of the label reps at Invite Manifestatio.
Okay. And so I'm guessing there won't be many communications uh, once the album is released. But if people want to follow you online to find out more about what you're creating and what your next steps may be, what's the best way to do that?
Follow Hvile I Kaos on Facebook or Instagram.
Is there anything else you want to say?
Well, it's certainly been a wild ride, 13 years. 13 is a significant number, seeing as that's the number of death. I'd say that's an appropriate number to end this trajectory on. Beyond that, I'm pretty much all I'd like to say is that the abyss looks different for everyone and presents differently for everyone. And eventually, you are going to have to decide whether you're okay with what presents to you from the abyss, because it won't always be pretty. And what I saw and experienced and what was asked of me have ultimately led me to the conclusion that this is where Hvile I Kaos ends.